I want to tell you something before I start. The last time I stood on that dock, I was 61 years old. It was the middle of August, and I had a decision to make that I never thought I'd have to make in my life. I could walk away from everything I'd spent 22 years building, or I could remember whose name was on the deed. I chose to remember, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before I can tell you how that summer ended, I have to tell you how it began. With a phone call I almost didn't answer, from a son I would have done anything for. His name is Daniel. He's 36 years old. He's an architect in Sacramento, which I am proud of. I am still proud of, even now, even after everything. I paid for every semester of his education. I drove him to his college orientation alone because his father's construction business was failing, and Frank was too ashamed to leave the office. I sat in that parking lot at University of Nevada, Reno, and watched my son walk toward his future, and I thought, whatever it costs, it was worth it. I thought a lot of things back then. I'm Margaret Cole. Most people call me Maggie. I spent 34 years as a public school principal in the Reno area, Washoe County Schools if you know the region. I retired at 58, 2 years before Frank died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, which is still the kind of sentence I have to take a breath before I say. Frank and I built a life here, a real one. Our home in Reno paid off, and the lake house, a property on the Nevada side of Tahoe that we started building the summer Daniel turned 14, adding to it every year with whatever we had left over. One summer it was a second bedroom, the next a proper deck. I used my mother's inheritance to pay off the last of it in 2019. My mother grew up in a town in rural Nevada that doesn't exist anymore, and she saved money her entire adult life into a land trust she never fully explained to me. She just said, "It's for later, Margaret. You'll know when." I knew when. The lake house was finished and debt-free, and I stood on that dock with Frank, and we didn't say anything for a long time. We just watched the water. That was enough. Frank died 14 months later. And I want to be honest with you about what grief does to a person, because I think we don't say it plainly enough. It makes you smaller. Not forever, but for a while. You stop taking up the same amount of space. You become grateful for whatever warmth is offered, even when it costs you something you can't name yet. That's how I ended up saying yes to things I should have questioned. When Brianna, Daniel's wife, they married 3 years ago, began rearranging the kitchen cabinets during visits to the lake house, I told myself she was just trying to help. When she started calling the master bedroom our room, I told myself that's how young couples talk. When she brought her mother up for a weekend without asking me first, I reminded myself that this was also Daniel's home, in some emotional sense, even if not a legal one. She's just finding her place, I told myself. Give her time. I gave her time. Before we go any further, if you're watching from somewhere that has difficult family situations just like this one, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories about quiet women who stop being quiet, please consider subscribing. This story is just getting started. The baby came last October. A little boy named Thomas, which was Frank's middle name, and I want to be clear, that meant everything to me. Daniel called me from the hospital, and his voice was different, softer and more frightened than I'd ever heard it, and I sat in my kitchen in Reno and cried the good kind of tears for the first time in over a year. I thought, this is the thing that brings us all together. I was wrong about that too. By December, the visits were shorter. By February, the Sunday calls started going to voicemail. By April, Daniel told me Brianna was finding it a little stressful to host anyone with a newborn, which I understood. I told him I understood. I stepped back. What I didn't know was that stepping back looked from where Brianna was standing like stepping out. The call came on a Wednesday in late June. I was on the back porch drinking coffee and watching the Reno heat settle over the valley like something patient and permanent. Daniel's voice was careful. Rehearsed, I understand now. He said he and Brianna had been talking, and that with Thomas so young, they felt like they needed the lake house this summer for just the three of them. He used the word boundaries. He used the phrase separate family unit. He said, "Mom, you don't need to come. My wife thinks it's better if we keep the lake house for our family this summer." I was quiet for a moment. Our family, I thought. As opposed to what, exactly? I said, "Okay, Daniel, I understand." I didn't cry until after we hung up. And then I cried for a long time, because I am human, and that was my child, and some hurts don't care how old you are when they find you. But here's what Daniel didn't know. 3 days later, I went looking for a document I half remembered seeing in Frank's desk, something I'd filed away after the funeral without reading closely. I found it in the bottom drawer, behind a folder of old Christmas cards. I sat down on the floor of that study and read it twice, and everything I thought I understood about my situation changed in about 4 minutes. What was in that envelope? And why did Frank hide it there, hidden where only I would ever think to look? I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Frank's desk until almost 2 in the morning, with that document in my hands, reading it a third time, then a fourth, the way you reread something when your brain keeps refusing to accept what your eyes are seeing. Outside, Reno was doing what Reno does in late June, that dry desert dark that feels different from anywhere else, quiet and absolute, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not. Frank had written the letter by hand. 7 pages, front and back, on the yellow legal pad paper he used for everything. His handwriting was never neat, big looping letters that leaned to the right like they were always in a hurry, and seeing it again after 14 months felt like something physical. Like a hand on my shoulder, he'd dated it 4 years ago, 6 months after Daniel's wedding. "Maggie," it began, "if you're reading this, I was probably right about something I hoped I was wrong about. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I didn't say this to your face. I tried to, twice. But you loved him so completely that I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was asking you to love him less. I wasn't. I'm not. I just want you protected." I put the letter down after that paragraph and looked at the wall for a while. He saw it, I thought. He saw it and he didn't tell me. And then, and this is the part I'm not entirely proud of, my next thought was, how long did he know? I'll tell you what the letter said in full eventually, but let me tell you what it contained, because those are 2 different things. It contained a promissory note, signed by Daniel, dated 6 years ago, 2 years before the wedding. Frank had lent our son $47,000 to help launch his architectural firm. Startup costs, equipment, software licenses, the deposit on his first Sacramento office space. The note was legal. It was witnessed. It specified that repayment would come from Daniel's inheritance share if it hadn't been settled before Frank's death. Daniel had never paid back $1. Frank had never mentioned it to me. I turned the note over in my hands and tried to remember 6 years ago. I tried to remember if there had been any conversation, any moment where Frank seemed worried about money, any shift I'd missed. There were a few. I'd chalk them up to the construction business, which had always moved in cycles. He was protecting me from worrying, I thought. And then he ran out of time to tell me. I called my friend Ruth the next morning. Ruth Alderman. We've been friends since our daughters were in the same Brownie troupe back in 1994, which tells you something about what kind of friendship it is. She spent 30 years as a clerk in the Washoe County court system, which means she has seen everything, forgotten nothing, and has very little patience for people who believe the law is something that happens to other families. She picked up on the second ring. "You sound terrible," she said. "Frank left me a letter?" A pause. "How bad?" "It's not bad, exactly." I looked down at the promissory note on the desk. "It's more like, he left me an answer to a question I didn't know I was asking yet." Ruth was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register I recognized from 30 years of watching her handle things. Calm, focused. "Maggie, before you do anything else, before you call Daniel, before you say a word to anyone, I need you to go through every document in that desk. Every single one. Don't decide what matters yet. Just find everything." "Why?" Because in my experience, she said, when a man like Frank leaves one thing hidden, he usually left more than one. I spent the next 3 days going through that desk. Ruth was right. There was a second folder I'd missed entirely, tucked inside a hanging file labeled insurance, which I'd glanced at after the funeral and not opened again because the thought of reviewing Frank's life insurance paperwork alone felt unbearable. The folder wasn't insurance paperwork. It was documentation for something called the Halverson Mineral Trust. My mother's maiden name was Halverson, a land trust my mother had established in 1971, tied to a parcel adjacent to the lake house property. The trust had been generating lease income from a regional energy company for over a decade. Small amounts, annually, that had been quietly accumulating in a trust account at a Reno bank. There was a letter from the bank dated 8 months ago, addressed to me, forwarded to this address, that I had apparently received during the worst of my grief and never opened. The trust matured on August 24th. Current value, $340,000. I sat on the floor of that study for the second time in a week and didn't move for a long time. Mom, I thought, you wonderful, quiet, impossible woman. She had bought that land in 1971 for $11,000. She had never once mentioned it to me in the context of money. She talked about it as a parcel near the lake, a piece of Nevada she'd always loved. She'd said once, when I was maybe 12, that land will take care of itself, Margaret. Good things do, if you leave them alone long enough. I hadn't understood what she meant. I understood now. I want to pause here for just a moment. Maybe you've known this feeling, finding out that someone you lost was quietly protecting you in ways you never knew to thank them for. Maybe you know how that kind of love can break you open all over again, right when you thought you were starting to hold together. I don't know what I would have done without what I found in that desk. I don't know what kind of woman I would have become that summer. I called Harold Chen the following Monday. Harold had been Frank's and my attorney for over 20 years. Estate planning, the lake house title work, all of it. He's in his late 60s now, semi-retired, with an office on South Virginia Street that still has the same carpet it had when we first walked in with our mortgage paperwork in 1998. He met me at 2 o'clock. I brought the folder. He read quietly for about 15 minutes while I sat across from him and watched the ceiling fan turn. Finally, he set everything down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "Maggie, I need you to listen to me carefully. Do you know what you're holding?" "I think so." "The lake house," he said, "was purchased entirely with funds from your mother's estate before you and Frank commingled accounts. It was registered in your name alone. I did that title work myself. Under Nevada law, that property is your sole separate property. It cannot be transferred, assigned, or claimed without your written consent. There is no legal mechanism by which Daniel or anyone else can compel you to give it up." I'd suspected that, but hearing it said plainly, in Harold's careful attorney voice, was different from suspecting it. "And the trust?" I asked. He looked at the bank letter, then back at me. "This matures in 7 weeks." "I know. Maggie." He paused. "Does Daniel know this exists?" "No," I said. "Frank never told him." Harold nodded slowly. Something moved across his expression that I couldn't quite read. Not surprise, exactly. More like the look of a man confirming something he'd always half expected. "I want to refer you to someone," he said. "A colleague of mine. Her name is Diane Park. She handles intra-family estate disputes and property litigation. She is extremely good, and more importantly," he slid a notepad across the desk and wrote a name and number, "she is not afraid of anyone." I looked at the name. "Harold," I said. "Is this as serious as I think it is?" He met my eyes. "It's more serious," he said, "because there's one more thing I haven't told you yet." He opened a drawer and pulled out a file, his own file, from his own records, and placed it on the desk between us. It was a copy of an email, sent 4 months ago, from a Sacramento attorney I didn't recognize, to Harold. inquiring on Daniel's behalf about the process for transferring the Cole Lake House property into joint ownership and whether Maggie could be considered to have diminished capacity following her husband's death. The room went very quiet. Diminished capacity. That was the phrase they'd used. That was the phrase my son had let someone use about me. I drove home from Harold's office on a Tuesday afternoon in early July, and I did not cry. That surprised me. Every other hard moment in the past 14 months had eventually found its way to tears. Frank's death, the first Christmas alone, Daniel's phone call, even finding my mother's letter in that desk drawer. Grief had become so familiar that I almost expected it, the way you expect rain when the sky goes that particular shade of gray over the Sierra Nevada. But sitting in my car outside Harold's office with that email still vivid in my mind, diminished capacity, diminished capacity, diminished capacity, I felt something else entirely. Still, the specific stillness of a woman who has just finished being afraid. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes. Then I started the car, drove to the Rayleighs on South McCarran, bought groceries for the first time in 3 weeks like an actual meal required them, went home, and cooked myself dinner. They think I'm diminished, I thought, standing at the stove. Good. Let them keep thinking that Diane Park's office was in Midtown Reno, second floor of a converted Victorian on Maple Street, the kind of building that looks modest from the outside and means business the moment you walk in. She was younger than I expected. Early 40s, small, with the kind of focused stillness that reminded me of the best teachers I'd hired over 34 years, people who didn't need to raise their voice because they were always the most prepared person in the room. She read Harold's referral note, then the documents I'd brought, without speaking. When she finished, she set everything down and looked at me directly. Who else knows about the Mineral Trust? No one. Harold, now you, and me. Keep it that way. She picked up the promissory note. This is signed and witnessed? Yes. And Daniel has never made a payment? Not one. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when pieces are fitting together in a pattern they recognize. Mrs. Cole, I want to be direct with you. Your son and his wife appear to be operating on the assumption that you are emotionally compromised, legally uninformed, and socially isolated enough that you won't push back. That email to Harold suggests they've been planning this for at least 4 months. I know, that works in our favor. She leaned forward slightly. People who believe they've already won stop being careful. I thought about that, so what do we do? She almost smiled. We let them keep believing it, for now. For the next 2 weeks, I was the most agreeable version of myself. When Daniel called, which he did occasionally, with the careful politeness of someone managing a situation, I was warm. I asked about Thomas. I laughed at the right moments. When he mentioned, carefully, that he'd had his attorney look into some estate planning options, I said that sounded very responsible and that I trusted him to handle things. I could hear the relief in his voice. She's not going to fight, he was thinking. I knew my son's silences. What he didn't know was that 48 hours after that phone call, Diane filed a formal property title analysis with the county, 8 pages establishing the lake house as my sole separate property under Nevada law, unreachable by any transfer Daniel could compel. She sent a copy to his Sacramento attorney with a cover letter so precise and measured that it conveyed the legal equivalent of "try it." I was in Ruth's kitchen eating lemon cake when Diane called to tell me it had been delivered. How do you feel? Ruth asked. I thought about it honestly. Like myself again, I said. For the first time since Frank died, I feel like myself. Ruth refilled my coffee without saying anything. That was the right response. The call from Daniel came 3 days later. I was on my morning walk along the Truckee River. I'd started walking every day in early July. Something I used to do before Frank got sick and the habit fell away. The river was low for summer, the way it gets when the snowpack has been thin, running green and quick between the cottonwoods. His number lit up my phone and I stopped walking and answered, "Mom." His voice was different, tighter. I got a letter from a lawyer. Oh? You hired someone. I spoke with Harold, I said. He connected me with a colleague. I just wanted to make sure I understood my own paperwork. A silence. Mom, we weren't trying to take anything from you. It was just estate planning, diminished capacity. Of course, I said. I understand. Then why did your lawyer send something like that to ours? Daniel. I kept my voice even, gentle, almost. I'm just making sure everything is in order. That's all. Isn't that what you were doing too? He didn't have an answer for that. After we hung up, I stood by the river for a minute and watched the water move. He's rattled, I thought, but he doesn't know how rattled he should be. Ruth's daughter is named Claire. She's 34, works as a features journalist for a Reno-based outlet that covers human interest and legal affairs, and she comes to her mother's Thursday dinners often enough that over the course of July I simply became part of those evenings. We talked about the school system, about Nevada water rights, about the particular loneliness of being a widow in a house designed for two people. I never pitched her anything. I never mentioned my situation directly. But by the third Thursday she'd mentioned, casually, over pasta, that she knew a producer at a local morning news program who was always looking for stories about women navigating estate law after losing a spouse. There's more of it than people realize, she said, and most women don't know their rights until it's too late. I nodded thoughtfully and said that sounded like an important topic. That was all. A thread, quietly located, not yet pulled. The beginning of August arrived the way August always does in northern Nevada. Suddenly, the heat absolute and the light almost white by midday. I felt the calendar like a physical thing. August 24th was 3 weeks away. The Mineral Trust was 3 weeks away. And I hadn't yet played what Diane and I had begun calling, in our Thursday calls, the final cards. There were 3 of them. The first was the property title analysis, already delivered, already rattling their Sacramento attorney into silence. The second was the promissory note, prepared and ready to file as a formal estate demand the moment Diane gave the word. The third was something we hadn't fully decided how to use yet, a 17-minute phone recording from a call Brianna had made to me in late July. I want to tell you how that call happened, because it matters. I had driven to the lake house on a Wednesday. Not secretly. I had every legal right to be there, more legal right than anyone else on earth, but quietly. I brought a Reno notary named Gerald who Harold had used for decades and a locksmith, and we changed the exterior lockbox code and filed a notarized notice establishing the property as my sole legal residence for tax purposes. Then I sent Gerald and the locksmith back to their cars, and I walked through the house alone. Brianna had rearranged the furniture in the living room. There was a mood board pinned to the kitchen wall, a Sacramento interior designer's renovation concept, printed and annotated, new countertops, new floors, an addition off the back deck that would have required a structural permit. My mother's rocking chair had been moved to a corner like an afterthought. I moved it back to the window where it belonged. I watered Frank's tomato plants on the back deck, which were still alive despite everything. I sat on the dock for 2 hours and let the lake be exactly what it had always been. Then I left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter for Daniel. Not angry, not legal, just honest. I built this place so our family would have somewhere to come home to. I still believe in that. Call me when you're ready to talk. Mom. I drove back to Reno. That evening my landline rang. It wasn't Daniel. Brianna's voice was controlled at first, measured. She'd clearly rehearsed the opening, something about boundaries and stress, and how I was making things harder than they needed to be. I listened. I said very little. I let her talk, and then something shifted in her. Maybe it was the silence on my end. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of a summer of believing she'd already won. Whatever it was, the rehearsed version of Brianna ran out, and the real one kept going. She said I was punishing Daniel for building his own life. She said the changes she'd made to the house were improvements, and I should be grateful. She said my mother's jewelry had been just sitting there, and she'd thought I wouldn't even notice. That sentence landed somewhere deep and quiet in me. She said she'd thought I wouldn't even notice. I let her finish, every word. Then I said softly, "Thank you for explaining that, Brianna. I understand now." And I hung up. Nevada is a one-party consent state. My landline had been set to record since the second week of July, on Diane's advice, for exactly this possibility. The call was 17 minutes and 23 seconds long. I called Diane the next morning. "She called," I said. A pause. "Did she say anything useful?" "She said quite a lot." Another pause. Longer. When Diane spoke again, there was something careful in her voice. Not excitement exactly, but the precision of someone who has just watched the last piece of a very long puzzle arrive. "Maggie, I want you to do something for me. I want you to write down from memory everything she said in order, as accurately as you can. Do it today, while it's fresh. Date it, sign it. All right? And Maggie?" She paused. "I think it's time we talked about August 24th. Diane laid it out on a Tuesday morning, 10 days before the trust matured. 3 moves, coordinated, time to land within 48 hours of each other. The first, a formal demand letter from Harold's office for the $47,000 promissory note as executor of Frank's estate, which I controlled. Certified mail, delivered to Daniel's Sacramento address. The second, a motion filed in Washoe County Court to freeze the relevant estate distribution pending resolution of the promissory note, citing evidence that estate funds had been misused. Specifically, a $12,000 deposit paid to a Sacramento interior designer for renovation plans on a property Daniel did not legally own. Diane had found this through the designer's public business filings. The deposit had come from a joint account containing funds from Frank's estate distribution. The third, on August 24th itself, the mineral trust would liquidate $340,000. Into my account, on record, publicly, permanently, irrevocably. "They'll see the court filing," I said. "Yes, and the promissory note demand, yes, but not the trust, not until it's done." Diane looked at me steadily. "Not until it's done." I sat with that for a moment. Outside her midtown window, Reno moved through its Tuesday business. Traffic on Maple Street, someone's sprinklers catching the morning light, a woman pushing a stroller past a coffee shop that had been there since before Daniel was born. "Frank," I thought, "I hope you can see this." "Do it," I said. The demand letter arrived at Daniel's Sacramento address on August 14th. I know because he called me 6 hours later, and for the first time in this entire summer, he sounded genuinely frightened, not angry, not managed, frightened. "Mom, Dad left a promissory note?" "He did. Why didn't you tell me?" I considered that question honestly. "Because I only found out recently, Daniel. He left it in his desk, for me to find when I needed it." Silence. Mom, that's $47,000. I know what it is." "We don't have," he stopped, started again. "Brianna and I are in the middle of some financial commitments right now, and this timing is—" "I know about the interior designer, Daniel." The silence this time was different, longer, the kind that means someone is recalculating everything. "How do you know about that?" I didn't answer the question. "I think we should meet," I said. "Just the two of us, at the lake house. There are some things I'd like to show you." Another silence. "Okay," he said finally. His voice had gone very quiet. "Okay, Mom." I hung up and sat in Frank's chair and looked at the photograph on the desk, the one of me at 40, hammer in hand, first beam of the lake house deck going up, squinting into the Nevada sun with sawdust in my hair. I looked like someone who knew exactly what she was building. Turns out I still do. He arrived on a Thursday, August 19th. 5 days before the trust matured, the drive from Sacramento is about 2.5 hours through the Sierra Nevada, I-80 west through Truckee, then south on 267 toward the lake, and I knew from the timestamp on his text that he'd left early, before Brianna was likely awake. He didn't tell her he was coming, I thought. That means something. I was sitting on the dock when his rental car, they'd been sharing one car, apparently, Another detail I filed quietly away. Pulled into the gravel drive. I heard the door. I heard his footsteps on the path Frank and I had laid ourselves, river stone we'd hauled up from a dry creek bed 2 summers in a row, because the good stone was always worth the extra work. I didn't turn around until he was at the end of the dock. He looked thin. He'd always been lean like Frank, but this was different. The thinness of someone not sleeping, not eating right, running on the particular fuel of anxiety that burns everything else away. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, and he looked, in that moment, so much like the boy I'd driven to college orientation that something in my chest pulled hard. He's still my son, I thought. That hasn't changed. That won't change. But it cannot be the reason I back down. Hey, Mom. Hey, sweetheart. Sit down. He sat beside me on the dock, legs hanging over the edge the way he used to as a teenager. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The lake was doing what it does in the morning, flat and silver near the shore, deeper blue toward the middle. The Nevada mountains reflected so clearly in the water it looked like there were 2 of everything. I've missed this place, he said quietly. I know, I said. Me too. I had placed 3 things on the dock between us before he arrived. I didn't explain them when he sat down. I let him look. Frank's handwritten letter, the promissory note, a copy of the court filing. He picked up the letter first. I watched his face while he read it. I had memorized it by now. Every line, every looping letter. But I watched my son encounter his father's words for the first time, and I saw the exact moment he reached the part about Brianna. His jaw tightened. His eyes went still. He read it to the end. Set it down carefully, like it was something fragile. He wrote this 4 years ago, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. 6 months after your wedding. He nodded slowly. He didn't look at me. He looked at the water. He never said anything to me. No, he didn't. I paused. Frank wasn't a confrontational man, you know that. He was a protector. He protected the people he loved in the ways he knew how. Quietly, in advance, so that if something went wrong, you'd already have what you needed. Daniel's throat moved. He thought something would go wrong. He hoped he was wrong, I said. He said so, right there in the letter. A long silence. A motorboat moved across the far end of the lake, and its wake reached us eventually, small waves lifting and dropping under the dock, gentle and indifferent. Mom? His voice was low. The email. The one Harold showed you, about diminished capacity. He finally looked at me. His eyes were wet. That wasn't my idea. I want you to know that. I should have stopped it. I didn't stop it, and I know that's not an excuse. But it wasn't my idea. I looked at my son for a long moment. I believe him, I thought, and it doesn't change what he allowed. I know the difference between your ideas and Brianna's, I said carefully. I've always known. What I couldn't understand was why you kept choosing hers over mine. I paused. Over your father's. Over everything we built. He didn't answer that. Maybe because there wasn't an answer that would hold up in the morning light, on this dock, with Frank's letter sitting between us. He picked up the promissory note next. Read it, set it down. I always meant to pay it back, he said. I know you did. Things got complicated with the firm. The first 2 years were really, Daniel, gently. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm asking you to settle it. I slid the folder across the dock. Diane had prepared it the week before. Clear, clean, no more legal complexity than necessary. 4 pages. The lake house remains solely in my name, permanently. Upon my death, Daniel would have right of first refusal to purchase it at fair market value, not receive it, purchase it, conditional on the promissory note being repaid in full within 18 months, on a schedule we would agree on today. The court motion regarding the estate funds would be withdrawn upon signing, provided the interior designer situation was resolved separately. That was between Daniel and Brianna and the Sacramento attorney, not me. My mother's jewelry was to be returned within 30 days. Diane had attached a valuation from a Reno appraiser based on Brianna's Instagram photographs. The number was specific and non-negotiable. Future visits to the lake house were by invitation, coordinated with me in advance. Not because I wanted to keep my son away, the opposite. Because I wanted the door to mean something when it was open. Daniel read every page. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He picked up the pen I'd set beside the folder and he signed his name in 4 places, and his signature looked like Frank's, the way it always had, those looping letters leaning forward like they were in a hurry. When he set the pen down, he kept his hand flat on the paper for a moment, like he was steadying something. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. I put my hand over his. "I know you are." We sat there for a while without talking. The lake moved, the mountains held still. Somewhere in the tree line behind the house, a Steller's jay made its argument to no one in particular, which is what Steller's jays do. Frank would have laughed at that bird, I thought. He always called them the attorneys of the forest. I almost said it out loud. Instead, I just listened to it, and I let that be enough. August 24th came on a Sunday. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at Frank's desk in my Reno house with my laptop open. At 9:02 a.m., a deposit notification appeared in my account. $340,000. I stared at it for a long moment. I thought about my mother standing on that land in 1971, 51 years ago, a young Nevada woman who didn't have much and knew how to make it last. I thought about what she'd understood that I was only now learning, that some things only work if you leave them alone long enough. That patience isn't the same as passivity, that quiet women are not, as a general rule, defeated women. You knew, I thought. You always knew this day would come. You just weren't sure which of us would need it. I said her name out loud once, just to say it. The house held it for a moment and then let it go. I set aside a portion of the trust, $60,000, in an education account for Thomas, in my name, under my terms, structured so that the funds would be available for his college education, regardless of what happened between his parents or between me and Daniel. He was Frank's grandchild. He was my mother's great-grandchild. Whatever had happened this summer, he hadn't done anything wrong, and he deserved to know his grandmother thought about his future. I instructed the bank to send Daniel a formal notification of the account's existence. Nothing more. No message, no explanation. Just the fact of it, arriving in his inbox like a reminder that love and accountability can exist in the same sentence. The things I didn't orchestrate happened on their own, the way consequences generally do when they're allowed to move at their natural speed. The court filing had created a public record. The Sacramento attorney handling Daniel's affairs apparently had a conversation with him about the risks of continuing to contest anything, given the recording Diane had referenced in correspondence. The word recording did significant work without the recording ever being played. Brianna's renovation never happened. The designer's deposit became a civil dispute I had no involvement in. Her Instagram stayed private. The lake house content disappeared from her feed quietly, the way things disappear online when the story behind them has become inconvenient. I heard through a cousin of Daniel's who still called me on birthdays that things between them were difficult. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest about that. I didn't. I felt something more like the specific sorrow of watching someone you love live in a smaller life than they could have chosen. Daniel was capable of so much more than he'd been these past 3 years. Whether he found his way back to that was not something I could decide for him. What I could decide was whether the door remained open. It did, on my terms, which were not punishing terms. They were simply honest ones. Ruth brought 3 women from our Thursday dinners to the lake house on the first weekend of September. Her neighbor Carol, who taught kindergarten for 30 years and had the energy of someone who'd survived 30 years of kindergarten. A woman named Deb, who'd retired from the Reno Fire Department and had opinions about everything, delivered with the directness of someone accustomed to emergencies. And Ruth herself, who brought a good bottle of Pinot Noir from a winery she liked in Washoe Valley and announced that we were celebrating. "What are we celebrating?" Carol asked. Ruth looked at me. "Property rights," I said. Deb laughed so hard she nearly fell off the deck chair. We cooked badly and ate well, and stayed up later than any of us had in years, and at some point after midnight I walked down to the dock alone and stood in the dark and looked at the water. No golden hour this time, just the lake under a Nevada sky, so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, like the universe was showing off. I thought about the version of me who had stood on this same dock 2 months earlier, with bags packed at her feet, shaking on the drive home, crying alone at Frank's desk. I thought about what it had cost to get from there to here, not in money, not in legal strategy, but in the quieter currency of deciding, at 61 years old and 14 months widowed, that diminished was not who I was. Frank had known that. My mother had known it before him. It had just taken me a summer to remember it myself. Daniel calls on Sundays again. The calls are shorter than they used to be, more careful. There are things we don't say yet, on both sides, because some repairs take longer than a season. But he asks about the lake house genuinely now, not strategically. He told me last month that Thomas has started pulling himself up on furniture and falling down and getting up again with the absolute determination of someone who has decided walking is non-negotiable. He sounds like your father, I told him. Yeah, Daniel said, and his voice had that softness in it again, the one I'd heard from the hospital the night Thomas was born. He really does. I'll take it. All of it. The careful calls, the long road back, the things that are still tender. I'll take it. Because the alternative is a closed door. And I built this family the same way I built that lake house, one summer at a time, with my own hands, because I believed it was worth the work. I still believe that. That's the thing they didn't understand, Daniel and Brianna, when they made their calculations about who I was and what I would do. They looked at a grieving woman alone in a dated house and they saw someone diminished. They forgot that I was the one who built the thing they wanted. They forgot what builders know, that you don't walk away from what you made. You find out what it's made of. Turns out it was made of something that lasted. I've been thinking, since that summer ended, about what I would have done if I hadn't found Frank's desk drawer, if the letter hadn't been there. If Harold hadn't kept that email, if my mother's trust had already been spent, I think about the women who face this without any of those things. No document, no ally, no hidden safety net, just themselves, and whatever they can find, and the question of whether that's enough. So I want to ask you something, and I mean it honestly. If it had been you on that dock, no letter, no trust, no promissory note, nothing but your own name on the deed and the memory of every nail you drove into that place with your own hands, would that have been enough to make you stay and fight? Or would you have walked away? I'd really like to know. For Frank, for Mom, for every woman who found the letter a little too late, and fought anyway.